Hey everybody, Phil here. Today I'm going to give you a peek behind the curtain at 5 kind of silly sticky notes that I have on my computer monitor to remind me of things that are important to my game. Obviously, these won't all apply to you, but I do think that some of the concepts you'll find helpful. So the first note I have just reads, "It's so simple." And this note is here to remind me to focus on the game that I've prepared for. So when I play, I go into each session against each opponent, each match with a game plan that I work on away from the table. I study the approach that I want to take in solvers, and then as I study that opponent over time, I adjust that to what I want to do against them to exploit their tendencies. Sometimes what happens to me is in game, I sense patterns, and normally pattern recognition is really useful for a poker player, but oftentimes our barometer of patterns can be misleading. So let's say I go into a session with a plan of, on rivers, I know that if a few draws miss, this player overbluffs. So I'm going to overcall with bluff catchers on river. We play a hand out and it gets to showdown and my opponent checks. And he checked with a hand that I thought would always bluff in this spot. And so I start to question, okay, is my plan good or is he adjusting, knowing what I'm doing in the last couple of sessions? I start to get in my head. The same thing can be true of, oh, he's check raised 3 paired flops in a row. Maybe he's away from the table, developed a game plan to attack paired flops, and now I need to do something about it. So the problem with this is, first of all, oftentimes these reads in game are driven by fear. There's a voice in the back of my head, oh, he's attacking this, or he's taking advantage of you in a spot that you weren't prepared for. And that comes from a place of fear. Now, in practice, of course, maybe my opponent did make an adjustment and I need to react to it. But the thing is, I have so much time in between sessions when I'm not playing, when that voice in the back of my head that is based on emotion is not yelling at me, to calmly look back at stats, look back at hands that were played and reach showdown, and determine whether or not my opponent is likely to have actually made an adjustment. And then I can formulate a counter strategy. So not only am I going to analyze it worse in game, I also don't have time to formulate a counter strategy, so I'm actively playing. I mean, I personally can do a pretty good job of figuring out a counter to a perceived leak or tendency, but you're always going to do better away from the table. The other thing is that obviously sometimes we're just getting fooled by randomness. Maybe the reason that your opponent's check raised paired boards 3 times is that he's had trips 3 times, or maybe he's had trips twice and a perfect bluffing combo once, or maybe he's had 3 perfect bluffing combos and he's playing the exact same strategy as he's always played. It's so important not to overreact to tiny, tiny samples like that, especially when you're emotional and in the heat of battle. Maybe the reason your opponent checked back that river that you didn't expect him to is because your perception of how your opponent views that board and views their range is not exactly in line with the way they actually view that board and view that range. Or maybe your opponent is not in a bluffing mood today, or maybe your opponent is not in a bluffing mood that very minute because he just lost a big pot. There are so many explanations for slightly unusual play over a tiny sample, and reacting to it in game is something that I think can only go poorly. The last reason that I think making those big deviations in game or reacting to the way that your session is playing out in game can go wrong is that it can often feel like, let's use the same example, our opponents check raised the flop on a paired board 3 times, and we folded 3 times because we didn't have anything. It can feel like your game plan is not prepared for that. But if you prepared well, studying with whatever method you use, with a coach, with a solver, with a combination of a solver and your opponent's stats breaking down the way that you want to counteract the way that they play, your game plan is probably pretty close to fine and not super exploitable to being check raised on a paired flop, for example. So I happened to have a terrible hand 3 times in a row and I got check raised and I just folded. And it feels like in that tiny sample, he's running me over. But in reality, I'm going to have trips sometimes. I'm going to have overpairs sometimes. I'm going to have flush draws. I'm going to have combo draws. I'm going to have a lot of hands that can fight back. And the fact that I didn't have those hands in the moment can make it feel like this is a leak in my game that my opponent's taking advantage of and I have to do something about it. In reality, it's just not. So there was one match I was playing in a while ago. My opponent was somebody who just did not make enough big bluffs. So of course, when the pot was checked down till the river and he didn't have anything, he would bluff. And if he called a flop bet, turn went check, check, and he missed his draw, he would bluff, things like that. When he has a really good blocker, he's going to throw in a 2-barrel or occasionally 3-barrel bluff. But for the big river check raises, for the big 3 barrels and 3-bet pots, he just wouldn't go for it. And this was especially true of spots where I could have a very strong hand. He was just, in my assessment, afraid to bluff in those situations. And I was playing a session and we played out a pot. I actually don't know the exact board. I 3-bet, he called, I checked, he bet, and he bet 3 times. And he 3-barreled in a big pot, all in on the river. And his hand at showdown was a hand that was, I never would have expected him to bluff. Had no relevant blockers. It was just, seemed pretty crazy to me. And in that session, I was pretty afraid because I was planning to overfold in every big pot. And if I was wrong about that, if he'd noticed that in previous sessions I was doing that, this is an exploit that he could employ that really would take advantage of my strategy in a big way. I had that fear, and I did adjust my play a little bit in that session. Fortunately, we didn't get into too many big pots where he was putting a lot of money in, because that just, frequency-wise doesn't happen that often. But when I looked back after the session, I actually looked that hand up in a solver, and his bluff was solver approved. I was very surprised. So I didn't think that it was a solver approved bluff. And so I thought, wow, if he's even bluffing, I didn't even think he bluffed all the hands that a solver would, or even close. Now he's bluffing this crazy hand that I would never consider bluffing. But it actually turns out he just had a better understanding of proper strategy in that spot. And he realized that he actually had a really good combination for bluffing. And I was the one who didn't understand that. And so that's one example of a time where I felt, for very good reason, afraid in game. And I found out after the session, after looking up the hand, I did not need to be so afraid. So my next note says discipline, power. The elements that I judge my sessions on are discipline, power, and focus. I don't need a note that tells me to focus because I always know that's a good thing. Discipline, I think, is the more obvious one. People know what that word means. But essentially for me, there are spots when you're autopiloting where you've got a decent bluff catcher plus some outs and you're facing a big turn bet and you're like, I'm pretty sure this is a call. In theory, I just flick in the call. Or you're facing a small river bet in a spot where you have a decent bluff catcher and you don't go through the process of hand reading, or I don't go through the process of hand reading and I just flick in the call. These are situations where I'm lacking discipline, because sometimes if I know my opponent well enough, I could know that given the way the board ran out and the actions my opponent has taken, he's going to underbluff that river spot. Or given the way that, same thing, he's going to have too strong of a range for me to call that turn bet. Obviously, all the examples that I've come up with in this video so far involve me being up against nitty opponents and me needing to find more folds. But when it comes to discipline, it's very applicable. Obviously, against opponents who are overly aggressive and bluffing too much, I need to find more calls. But usually when I'm having an undisciplined session, I don't struggle finding the calls. When I'm having an undisciplined session, I do struggle finding the folds. For me specifically, against small bets on turn and river, and against bets on flop and turn where I have hands that have a little bit of value and can improve. Those are the types of spots where I call too often when I'm being undisciplined. Power is not as self-explanatory as discipline, so allow me to explain it to you. The way that I use power as it relates to poker, I guess the closest words that embody the sentiment there would be intensity and relentless execution. When I'm playing a session without enough power, I'll find myself in a spot where I know that my opponent is betting a little bit too weak of a range on the turn. And I know that if I check raise, bluff the turn, and jam river, he's going to overfold overall. And it's a profitable play by a little bit, but I just don't feel like doing it. I don't feel like taking that risk, and I shy away. And usually the plays that go first are those big bluffs. And then sometimes the big calls that I think are plus, 1 or 2 big blinds in EV, those go away and I kind of play a more lax session. The problem with this, especially when you're playing against tough competition, as I almost always do, is that when I have the value hand that's supposed to check raise the turn and bomb river, I'm never going to shy away from that. And so what happens is my range gets out of whack. Every time I have the value hand, I go for it because going for it is easy. It's emotionally easy. But when I'm in a low power mood, I don't go for it with the bluffs. And so when my opponent's sitting there on the river and I'm supposed to be bluffing something like a third of the time, I'm actually bluffing maybe 12% of the time in a low power session. And so if I have half of my sessions as low power, I always put myself in bad spots where I have to do math on the fly. But essentially, if half my sessions are at low power, then maybe my average bluff frequency there is 22% instead of the 33% that it needs to be. And even if my opponent can't figure out when I'm in a low power session or having a low power 2 hours of the session, I'm still not going to find enough bluffs overall, and I'm going to be under bluffing that spot. And so my opponent can exploit me, if he figures that out, by overfolding. Power is one of the toughest ones for me to consistently maintain. It's so easy to start a session with power, do a lot of things. I do a lot of things pre-session to prepare, which we could talk about in another video. But it's easy to start a session with power for me, but lose a couple pots early, sometimes win a couple pots early, or just have 3 hours go on and I'm feeling pretty comfortable having fun. It's easy for me to lose that power and just not be in the mood to make the big play. The next note that I have says hand read in all caps, underlined with an exclamation point. This doesn't require as much explanation. You get it. Hand reading is important. It's so easy to, in a session, revert to autopilot and be in a river spot facing a bet and say, well, I have the spade blocker. This hand's supposed to call, click call and move on. Or, oh, I don't have a good blocker to call here, click fold and move on. When I'm playing my best, in every given spot, I'm reading the way that my opponents played on every street. I'm thinking about the way that they've played essentially every hand that we've played together before, my profile of them that I have in my mind. I'm thinking, okay, well, given the board ran out this way, do I think that they're going to struggle to find enough bluffs? Do I think that they're going to struggle to restrict their bluffs and then be over bluffing? Oftentimes the single blocker on the river is going to move things like 1 or 2%, whereas there are so many spots, even against great players, where I think they're 15% off with their frequencies. Reverting to autopilot, just letting the 1 or 2% things like blockers shift my river play is essentially just lazy play. And it's really, really hard to play for 6 hours straight with complete focus and complete power and complete discipline and hand reading throughout. It's just hard. Our minds, or my mind, is not built to be able to sustain the same level of energy and focus throughout that entire time. So I've got that sticky note there to remind me throughout the session, all right, Phil, we've fallen a little bit off course. Let's take this opportunity to refocus, settle in, and play our best. Hey, before this next one, if you are enjoying this video, please consider subscribing to my channel. I'm making a lot more content in the coming months, and I think you'll enjoy it as well. All right, the fourth note that I have sticking on my computer says, game plan, no protection, which probably looks strange to people who are not poker players. In poker, what this means to me is stop making the lazy protection bets on flop and turn. A lot of people watching this are probably going to ask me, Phil, what's wrong with betting for protection? Isn't that part of the game? The real answer is going to be a 10, 20-minute video. My answer for now will be that protection is a tiny slice of the reason that you want to bet flops and bet turns. But the way that people tend to approach it is they overvalue it way too much. I overvalue it less than almost anybody, and I still have the note to remind myself not to overvalue it too much. So that gives you an idea of how important I think it is, or how flawed I think the way most people think through spots when it comes to protecting your hand actually is. I'll leave you with a little quote from a friend of mine that I found really helpful on this topic. I was reviewing a hand with a friend, a pretty simple small hand where I was deciding whether or not to c-bet. And I had a weak value hand on a draw heavy board. He didn't like that I bet. And I said, well, I know that my hand is going to be pretty good now against the range it's calling me. And on a lot of turns and rivers, it's going to be uncomfortable, both facing bets, and I'm not going to find a lot of opportunities to value bet. This was like a top and middle pair, or top and bottom pair in PLO on, let's say, a 9-7-3-2 hard board. My friend said to me, those reasons that you're giving, that it's going to be really uncomfortable on turns and rivers, not going to be a very strong hand on turns and rivers. When that's the case, your hand is not worthy of protection. In order to protection bet, you need to have a good enough hand that it's worthy of it. It's a bit of an oversimplification because there are so many factors at play, but I really liked that. That really spoke to me because it just changed the way I was evaluating the strength of my hand. And my last sticky note says, patience, some pots aren't mine. This is exactly what it sounds like. Essentially, the way that it would come up for me is I would call a 3-bet in PLO. The flop would be, let's say, a low straight board. My opponent would check because it's a really bad board for his range. And I would have a terrible hand. And my thought process would be, well, if I check back, I'm not gonna be able to represent it very well. I can only bet third pot and take it down against a bunch of different hands. Let's just try to win this pot. And what happens there, obviously, is my range gets way out of whack because I'm just betting all of my bluffs in that situation. And so my betting range has too many bluffs. My checking range doesn't have enough hands I can bluff later. Delayed aggression is something that I think I need to remind myself of sometimes. There are times that similarly, I'll make a read that my opponent's flop betting range is a little bit too weak. And rather than call in position with a hand that can call, I'll just go ahead and attack right now with a raise. Yet I'm not representing that many hands with a raise and actually calling and waiting to see if my opponent checks turn so that I can bet, or even have the turn go check check and see if he checks river so that I can bet, is often going to be a higher EV line. This sticky note is there to remind me, don't think about how I can win this pot, think about how I can make the most money. And sometimes that means conceding the pot. I personally find these reminders really helpful, even though they're so simple, just like one of the reminders itself. Some people don't. Some people don't have sticky notes. They work in different ways. If you are one of those people and this wasn't helpful to you, I'm sorry to hear that, but hopefully it helped you. And for some of you, it gave you some insight into the way that I think through things, the problems that I struggle with in my game, and perhaps can give you some insight into some areas that you struggle with that you may not have realized. I appreciate everybody watching. Please consider subscribing. I'm creating a lot more content in the coming months, so you won't want to miss it. Until next time, take care.